My name is Adele Fairbanks, 34 years old. 3 weeks ago, I closed the sale of my company for $7 million cash. Then I told my family I went bankrupt. I just wanted to know if they'd still love me when I had nothing. They answered on the lawn. My boxes lay ruined in the pouring rain. My father stood on the porch he didn't own and spat. "You've always been a pathetic failure who never should have been born into this family." My sister gave me a cold, mocking smile, picked up a hot dog, and casually tossed it onto my windshield. The mustard slowly dripped down the glass like silent contempt. I didn't scream. I simply reached down, picked up the one framed photo of my grandmother from the mud, and drove away in silence. One day later, they discovered the truth about the $7 million. My phone rang 35 times. I let every single call go to voicemail, and the secret my grandma left behind was finally ready to burn their world to the ground. I'm Adele. If any part of that already landed somewhere tender in you, stay with me a while. I think you'll understand by the end why I had to tell it. This is the story of the night my family finally learned who I really was, but to understand the lawn, you have to understand the table. So let me take you back about 10 years, to a dinner where I learned how to disappear in plain sight. The dining room smelled like pot roast and furniture polish, the way it always did on a Sunday. I was 24, sitting in the chair farthest from my father, the one nearest the kitchen door, so I could clear plates without being asked. That was my job in that family. Not loved, useful. My mother, Carol, set the gravy boat down and looked at me the way you look at a stain you've decided to live with. "You always make people feel like they're being audited, Adele," she said. Around the table, everyone laughed. My father chuckled into his glass. My sister, Bryn, 3 years younger and the son the whole house revolved around, smiled at me with her head tilted like I was a pet that had done something almost clever. I had just spent the week tracing a $250,000 embezzlement through 4 shell companies for a client who shook my hand and called me a miracle. At this table, the same brain that did that made me the cold one, the difficult one, the girl who couldn't take a joke. I learned early that there are 2 kinds of children in some families. There's the one whose every drawing goes on the fridge. And there's the one who's told the fridge is full. I was the second kind. Bryn was the first. Nobody ever decided it out loud. It was just the weather we lived in. I'll give you one example, because one is enough. When I was 19, I caught a mistake in my father's taxes that would have cost him a penalty, stayed up past midnight fixing it, and left it on the kitchen table with a note. He never mentioned it. 2 days later, he told a long dinner story about how Bryn had reorganized the garage and what a head for systems that girl had. I sat there with the corrected return 3 feet away and learned the lesson one more time. In that house, my work was furniture and Bryn's was art. I stopped leaving notes after that. I just kept my own copies. I passed the gravy. I said nothing. There was only one person who had ever looked at me across a table and seen something worth keeping, and she wasn't there anymore. I'll get to her. That same year, quietly, in a rented office above a hardware store, I started a company, Forensic Accounting. I followed money the way other people follow weather, patiently, knowing it always tells the truth eventually, even when people don't. I named the firm Birchwood, after the trees. I never told anyone in my family why, because in 10 years, no one at that table ever asked the name of my company. Not once. They knew Bryn's barista order by heart. They did not know what I did for a living, only that it embarrassed them at parties. So I stopped offering. I kept my own counsel and my own records. Every contract, every email, every receipt, filed and dated. People thought it was a quirk. It was a habit a girl builds when she grows up being told her version of events is wrong. A decade went by like that. Birchwood grew. I hired people, I bought a small apartment in Burlington with bare walls, because the only thing I ever hung was a photograph. And then last winter, an offer landed in my inbox. A national firm wanted to buy Birchwood. $7 million cash with a transition period where I'd advise. The subject line on the term sheet read, "Confidential until close." I should have felt triumphant. Instead, sitting alone in my kitchen at midnight with a contract that would change my life, I felt the oldest ache I knew. I wanted to call my mother. I wanted her to say she was proud. I knew she wouldn't. And knowing a thing and needing it are two different rooms in the same house. So I did something I am not proud of. The week before the deal closed, I drove 3 hours home and told them a lie. I sent my mother a text first, sitting in my car outside their place, thumb hovering before I hit send. Things fell apart. I lost the business. Can I come home for a while? I wanted to know if there was a place for me when I had nothing to offer. I wanted the test to come back clean. Delivered. Then nothing. 2 days of nothing. On the third day, my mother finally replied. One line. And the temperature of it told me everything I'd spent my life refusing to learn. Some families teach you to apologize for existing. The rain started somewhere around the state line and didn't stop. By the time I turned onto Cedar Hollow Road, the wipers couldn't keep up, and the old farmhouse rose up gray and streaming behind its row of white birch trees. My grandmother had planted those trees. I knew the shape of them in the dark. There were boxes on the lawn, my boxes, the few things I'd ever left in my childhood room, books, a winter coat, a shoebox of letters. Someone had carried them out and set them in the grass, and the rain had been at them long enough that the cardboard had gone soft and dark and was beginning to collapse in on itself. My father came out onto the porch before I'd even cut the engine. He didn't have a coat on. He didn't need one. He wasn't planning to be out long. "You've always been a failure," he said, loud enough for the Hendersons 2 houses down to hear, loud enough for my Aunt Lorraine, who'd come for the weekend and now stood frozen in the doorway with her overnight bag still on her shoulder. "Don't make it our problem." Bryn appeared beside him. She had a paper plate in her hand from some lunch, and on it a hot dog she hadn't finished. She looked at me through the rain, and she smiled, slow, pleased, and she picked the hot dog up and tossed it underhand at my windshield, almost lazy, the way you'd toss bread to a duck that you were tired of. Mustard slid down the glass. I want to tell you what I did, because it's the only part of that day I'm proud of. I got out of the car. I walked to the boxes. The rain went straight through my coat in seconds. I crouched in the grass and I opened the one that was caving in fastest, and inside, face down in an inch of water, was the framed photograph. My grandmother Vivian, on her porch, squinting into the sun, one hand raised against the light. The glass was beaded with water. I lifted it out. I wiped it once against my shirt, the only dry square inch of me, which wasn't dry at all. My hands were steady. I noticed that. I remember thinking, distantly, that my hands should not be this steady. I left the boxes. I took the photograph. I got back in the car. Aunt Lorraine had come down off the porch by then. 2 steps. Her mouth open like she meant to say something. She didn't. Nobody did. I backed down the driveway at exactly the speed limit, mustard sliding sideways across my view of the house I grew up in, until the birch trees swallowed it and there was only road. I did not cry. I want to be honest about that, because people always expect the crying. I drove 40 minutes to a gas station off the interstate, and I bought a black coffee I didn't drink, and I sat in the lot with the engine ticking, and I looked at my grandmother's face under the streetlight. That was the night I had everything and nothing at the same time. $7 million clearing into an account in the morning. And a hot dog on my windshield. The deal closed 2 days later. I signed the final documents in a conference room in Boston, shook 6 hands, and became, on paper, a wealthy woman. Nobody at that table in Vermont knew. To them, I was the bankrupt daughter who'd been sent away in the rain. That lasted exactly 1 day, because the buyers, being a national firm, did what national firms do. They put out a notice. It ran in a regional business roundup. 2 paragraphs, my name and the number, and a stock photo of a handshake. The kind of thing nobody reads. Except somebody's cousin reads everything. My phone was face down on my kitchen counter the next evening when it lit up the first time. Then again. Then it didn't really stop. My Aunt Lorraine had seen the notice. Lorraine had texted my mother, and my mother had texted back the question that I would, later, find almost funny. "Carol, is this our Adele? They're saying she just sold her company for $7 million. Our Adele." I'd been there, Adele, for about 90 minutes. The calls came in a wave. I counted them later, the way I count everything. 35. 11 of them left voicemails, and the voicemails were a study in how fast a person can change their face. The first one, from my mother, I have never deleted. I deleted the other 34. That one, I kept. "Sweetheart, we were only ever trying to protect you. Call your mother back." "Sweetheart," from the same throat that 40 hours earlier had let my father call me a failure on the lawn and said nothing. I set the phone down. I let it ring. I made myself a real cup of tea this time, and I drank it while it was hot. And I watched my screen flash my mother's name over and over against my grandmother's photograph, which I'd propped against the backsplash. I've thought about this a lot, so let me ask you the way I'd ask a friend sitting across from me. When that wave of calls finally hit, would you have picked up? Be honest with yourself for a second, because I'll tell you this much. What happened next had almost nothing to do with the $7 million. It had everything to do with something my grandmother signed before she died. Something my family had quietly buried for 8 years. And the first sign of it came not as one of those 35 calls, but as a single unknown number, a Vermont area code that started calling in the gaps between my mothers. Money doesn't change people, it just removes their disguises. To understand what that envelope meant, you have to meet the one person in my family who never made me feel like a stain. My grandmother, Vivian Hale, had hands like maps. I used to trace the veins on the back of them while she read to me. She lived in that farmhouse on Cedar Hollow Road her whole married life, and after my grandfather died, she lived in it alone. And she planted those birch trees this spring after the funeral because, she said, a house needs something young growing next to it or it forgets how. She was the only adult who ever sat across a table from me and listened to the whole sentence. When I was small and the rest of them were laughing at something at my expense, she'd catch my eye and not laugh. Later, in the kitchen, drying dishes, she'd say it plainly, the way she said everything. "You were always the smartest one in this family. That's why they're scared of you." I didn't believe the first half. I clung to the second, because it at least explained the weather. The summer I was 15, we painted the back fence together, white over the gray, the birch trees throwing their thin shade across us. She stopped halfway through, brush dripping, and looked at the house like she was checking it for something. "This house knows who belongs in it, Adele," she said. "Don't you let them tell you otherwise." I thought it was just a thing old women say about old houses. I laughed. She didn't. And once, I was almost grown by then, she said a thing I didn't understand, and tucked away the way you tuck away a key you don't yet have a door for. "I left the paperwork with Teddy," she said, apropos of nothing, watching the birches. "When the time comes, you go and see Teddy." I asked who Teddy was. She just patted my hand and changed the subject. She died in June, 8 years ago. I was 26. I drove up for the funeral and sat in a back pew, because by then I'd learned where I sat. Afterward, at the house, My mother organized the dividing of things with the calm efficiency she brought to everything. Vivian's pearls, her sewing table, the good china, all of it went to Bryn, laid out and labeled, while I stood in the hallway holding my own coat. I asked once, quietly, if there was anything Grandma had wanted me to have. My mother didn't even look up from the box she was taping. Grandma wanted Bryn to have her things, she said. You understand? I did understand. That was the trouble. I understood completely. I left that day with one object, a framed photograph of Vivian on her porch that had been sitting on a side table, that nobody had labeled, that nobody wanted. I took it because I couldn't bear to leave with empty hands a second time. It's the same photograph that was face down in the rain on the lawn 8 years later. It has been the only thing on my wall in every apartment since. There's a thing nobody warns you about being the unfavored child at a funeral. It isn't the grief, it's the math. You stand in the hallway and you do the arithmetic of your own worth in real time, watching it get divided up and handed to someone else. And you smile, because the alternative is to make a scene. And you have spent your whole life being told that you are the one who makes scenes. I didn't ask that day why the family lawyer wasn't there. Why a man named Teddy, who my grandmother had mentioned exactly once, had not come to bury a client he'd kept for 40 years. It didn't occur to me to wonder. My mother was the executor. My mother said everything had been handled. And I had been trained expertly by experts never to check my mother's math. I'd give a great deal to go back and ask that one question at that funeral. I didn't, so let me be honest about why I drove home into that rain 10 years later, with $7 million about to land and a lie in my mouth. It wasn't the house. I want to be clear, because it matters. I didn't want the house. I wanted to be wanted in it. That's the whole of it. A grown woman with a sold company and an empty apartment, driving 3 hours to run a test she already knew the answer to, because some part of her was still 15 and painting a fence, still waiting for the fridge to have room. I set my grandmother's photo on the counter that night, and I let the phone ring. And somewhere in the ringing, the Vermont number called for the 3rd time, and this time, because I was tired of being afraid of my own family, I picked up. Grief is just love, with nowhere left to go. The voice on the other end was old and careful, and it did something I wasn't ready for. It cracked. "Miss Fairbanks," he said, "my name is Theodore Brandt. I drew up your grandmother's will. Vivian Hale." A pause, the sound of paper. I only learned last week that she'd passed. 8 years ago. Nobody told me. I had the photograph in my hand. I sat down on the kitchen floor without deciding to. "I'm holding something of hers," Theodore Brandt said. "Something I think you need to see, in person." "Why wouldn't they tell you?" I asked. "If you were her lawyer, why wouldn't anyone tell you she died?" There was a silence on the line so long I thought the call had dropped. When he spoke again, his voice had gone very quiet. "That," he said, "is the question I've been asking myself for a week. Come to the office, please." I drove up the next morning. Not to Cedar Hollow Road, to a town 2 over, a main street with half its storefronts dark, and above a closed insurance agency, a frosted glass door that still read Brandt and Associates, Attorneys, the gold paint flaking at the edges. Theodore Brandt was older than his voice. He stood when I came in, both hands on his desk for balance, a tall man folded down by years. On the desk between us sat a single sheet of paper and a real estate listing, printed with a photograph of my grandmother's farmhouse and a price. $640,000. For sale. "They listed it," he said, following my eyes. "Bryn did, with your parents' names on the paperwork, too. A title company called my office last week to confirm an old detail in the chain. That's how I found out Vivian was gone." He sat slowly. Your grandmother kept me off her public filings on purpose. She used me privately, the way careful people do when they don't trust everyone around them. Whatever your mother put through probate 8 years ago, it went through a firm 2 counties over, and my name never touched it. It took a full title search, forced by this sale, before anyone looked back far enough to find me at all. He folded his hands. And that's how I found out that what they put through probate was never the will I drafted. The room was very still. Somewhere behind a half-open door, a kettle clicked off. "What you drafted," I repeated. He didn't answer with words. He reached into a drawer and he took out an envelope. It was thick, cream-colored, and sealed with a circle of dark wax that had cracked but held. It had been handled, but never opened. On the front, in handwriting, I would have known in the dark. The same hand that had written my name inside every birthday book I owned, were 5 words. "For Adele, when she's ready." An older woman put her head in from the back, the secretary gray and soft-spoken, and set a cup of tea beside me without a word, then squeezed my shoulder once on her way out. At the door, she paused. "She left that envelope with him years ago," she said, nodding at Theodore Brandt. "He's kept it locked in that drawer ever since. He never knew she'd died. If he had, dear, he'd have opened it himself a long time ago. He'd have come for you." I put my fingers on the wax. 8 years that envelope had waited in a drawer, 2 towns from where I cried in a back pew. 8 years it had said my name, while strangers labeled my grandmother's pearls for my sister. I broke the seal. A house remembers what a family tries to forget. There were 2 things inside: a folded document, heavy paper, blue-backed, the kind that means a lawyer touched it, and beneath it, a single, handwritten sheet. Theodore Brandt watched me unfold the document. He didn't reach for it. He let me find it myself, which I've since understood was a kindness. It was a will. Vivian Hale's will, signed and dated in the autumn of 2014. Witnessed, notarized. I read it the way I read everything, from the bottom up, where the truth usually hides in the clauses people assume no one will reach. The house on Cedar Hollow Road, the farmhouse, the land, the birch trees, was left, in plain language, to one person. To my granddaughter, Adele Fairbanks, who understands what a home is for. Only me? Not the family, not divided. Me. I read it 3 times. The 3rd time, the words stopped meaning anything and were just shapes, and my own pulse was loud in my ears, and the tea had gone cold against my hand, and I hadn't touched it. "She left the house to you, Adele," Theodore Brandt said gently. "Only you. What your mother filed was not this. It was an earlier document, a draft Vivian had moved past, that split the estate the conventional way and named your mother executor. They probated that one in another county. They never produced this. They may have told themselves it didn't exist." He folded his hands. "It exists. I notarized it. I watched her sign it. I want to describe the feeling, but the rules I live by don't allow the easy words, and anyway the easy words would lie. So I'll tell you what my body did. My stomach dropped the way it does in an elevator. My hands, which had been steady on the lawn in the rain, were not steady now. The paper shook, very slightly, and I had to set it down on his desk to keep from giving that away. Then I picked up the 2nd sheet. I need to slow down here, because this is the part of the story I would protect with my life, and I won't rush it for anyone. It was a letter. Her handwriting, gone a little uneven near the end of the lines the way it did in her last years, the ink darker where she'd pressed. There was a faint ring near one corner where she'd set a teacup down while she wrote it. I could see her doing it, at her kitchen table, birches at the window. She wrote, "My Adele, If you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have finally come back, and Teddy has done what I asked. I am sorry it took being gone for you to be allowed home. You were always the smartest one. You were the only one who ever looked at this family and saw it clearly, and they punished you for the seeing. I watched them do it for 30 years, and I did not stop it, and that is my great failure, and I will not make excuses for it now. So I'm doing the one thing I still can. I could not give you their love, my darling girl. I tried, and it was not mine to give, but I could give you the door. This house is yours. It always knew. Let it be the place where, for once, you do not have to earn your welcome. Be braver than I was. Don't wait as long as I did to choose yourself. All my love, every bit of it that was always, always yours. Grandma. I sat in that flaking office above a dead insurance agency, and I held a letter from a woman 8 years dead. And for the first time since the lawn, for the first time in longer than that, something in my chest came loose. I didn't sob. I just couldn't get a full breath for a moment, and one tear came off my jaw and landed on the desk. Not on the letter. I made sure of that. I turned my head so it wouldn't land on the letter. Theodore Brandt looked out the window and gave me the room. The old secretary, somewhere in the back, ran water in a sink so I wouldn't be heard. Strangers, the both of them, handling my grief more gently than my family ever handled anything. When I could speak, I didn't speak about my heart. I'd lived too long to expect anyone to fix that. I folded the letter carefully along the creases she had made, and I put it in my bag where the rain couldn't reach it. And I heard my own voice come out flat and clear and changed. Then what? I said. Did my mother actually file? Something shifted in me in that office, and I felt it happen. For 34 years, I had been asking the same useless question. Why don't they love me? And turning the answer over and over like a stone that never got smaller. I put the stone down. I picked up a different question, a colder one, the kind my whole career was built on. I stopped asking why they didn't love me. I started asking where the money went. Theodore Brandt heard the change. Old lawyers always do. He pulled a thin file toward himself and tapped it once. There's one more thing you should see, he said. Your grandmother didn't only leave you a house. She set up a trust, and the account, Miss Fairbanks, has been moving. He met my eyes. You should look at the trust. The bank statements arrived the way real evidence always does. Not in a thunderclap, but in a manila envelope, requested through the proper channels, sitting on my kitchen table on an ordinary afternoon. Theodore Brandt still had the original trust file. Vivian had named him, all those years ago, as a backup trustee she'd never had to use. Once I'd retained a probate litigator, and we'd filed our standing as the rightful heir. A subpoena did the rest. The bank handed over a decade of records, and I did what I have done for strangers 100 times. I sat down with a pot of coffee, and I followed the money. The trust had been funded with $200,000. Vivian had set it up quietly. Years before she died, the income meant to be split between her grandchildren, the principal protected. My mother was the trustee. I went through it line by line, and I marked each withdrawal in red, the way I always do. Every withdrawal had a memo. My mother is, if nothing else, a tidy bookkeeper of her own sins. Tuition, wedding, car, a down payment, a family loan. Withdrawal after withdrawal, year after year, each one with a tidy little note, and as I went, I realized something that made me set down my pen. None of them were mine, not one. Not a dollar of that trust had ever reached me. Roughly $160,000 of it had been spent, and every memo pointed in one direction. Bryn's college, Bryn's wedding, Bryn's car, the principal my grandmother had meant to protect, drained to fund the favorite child's life, while I was told, every step of my own, that there was nothing to spare, and that I'd have to make my own way. I'd made my own way. I'd built a $7 million company on my own way. I felt the old fury start, the cold kind, the kind that's useful, and I let it sharpen me instead of blind me. Then I did what I always do when the memos are too tidy. I stopped reading what they said and started tracing where the money actually went. And the money did not go where the memos pointed. The deposits didn't land in Bryn's accounts. They landed back in my mother's. And from there into the leak my parents never talked about at any of those dinners. My father's debts, the second mortgage, the slow, quiet bleed of a household that lived 2 notches above what it earned and called it dignity. The memo said Bryn. The money said Carol. Then I reached one line, near the middle, and the fury stopped being useful for about 10 seconds. A withdrawal. $8,000. The memo read, miscellaneous. And the date was the day we buried her. While I stood in that hallway holding my own coat, asking if there was anything my grandmother had wanted me to have, my mother had already moved money out of my grandmother's trust. That afternoon, that same afternoon, my hands went still on the page. The apartment was very quiet. I could hear the refrigerator and a clock, and from somewhere far off, the soft, persistent sound of nothing at all where a family should have been. I didn't write the easy word for what I felt. I just sat there until the light changed in the room, and when I came back to myself, it was nearly dark, and the coffee was cold, and I had not moved. Then I called my litigator. Her name is Diane Mercer, and she does not waste words, which is why I hired her. I laid it out. The original will, the notary, Theodore Brandt as living witness, the false probate, the drained trust, the breach of a trustee's duty. She was quiet while I talked. When I finished, she said one thing. With the original will and these statements, the old filing collapses. Diane Mercer said, "The trust is a separate matter. That's a fiduciary breach, and the dates make it ugly for her. But the clock that matters right now is the house. We need to file before that sale closes. Once it closes and clean money changes hands, untangling it gets a great deal harder." A pause. "How long until they close?" I looked at the listing, still on my counter. Under the price, a line. Sale pending. Closing scheduled. 3 weeks. There was one more thing in the records, and it's the thing I keep coming back to, because it changed the shape of the whole story for me. I'd assumed, the way you assume the obvious, that Bryn was on the other side of this. The favorite, the one who got the pearls and the trust and the wedding. The one who tossed a hot dog at my windshield and smiled. But when I traced the trust forward, past the withdrawals, to what was supposed to be sitting there for the grandchildren now, there was almost nothing left. A few $100s. A balance so small it was insulting, and Bryn, as far as I could tell, had no idea. The withdrawals weren't reaching Bryn, the adult, any more than they were reaching me. They went through my mother, in my mother's hand, with my mother's memos, wearing my sister's name like a coat. But the money itself, the control of it, never left Carol. The strange thing wasn't that they'd robbed me. It's that somewhere under all of it, they'd quietly robbed Bryn too. The golden child was just a better-dressed kind of pawn. I sat with that a long time. I wondered if she knew. I was fairly sure she didn't. Theft wears a cardigan when it lives in your family. There's a calendar on my kitchen wall. Plain paper, a free one from the hardware store below where my company started. That winter, I started doing something I'd never done before. I marked it. 1 red circle, 3 weeks out. The closing date. Here's the thing I have to confess. The choice I made that I'd make again. I could have stopped the sale with a single phone call. I could have rung my mother and told her I had the will, told her to take the house off the market, and maybe some quieter, smaller version of justice would have followed in private, where my family does all its business. I didn't want it in private. Private is where they'd always won, so I let the calendar run. I said nothing. I let them keep showing the house, let them keep telling the buyers everything was clean, let them walk toward a closing that I already knew, with the certainty of a woman who reads documents for a living, could never legally happen. I let them build their confidence as high as it would go. It is a particular feeling, watching people you grew up fearing stride confidently toward a cliff and choosing not to call out. I won't pretend it didn't have a taste to it. The text started about a week in. My mother, who had not spoken to me since sweetheart, reached out as if nothing had happened, as if there had never been a lawn. We're family. Let's put the misunderstanding behind us. Come to dinner Sunday. A misunderstanding. The rain, the boxes, the hot dog. My father's voice carrying to the Hendersons' yard. A misunderstanding. I didn't answer with anger. I'd learned finally that anger was the thing they knew how to use. I answered with nothing, and I did one small thing instead. I screenshotted the message, dated it, and dropped it into a folder on my laptop. The folder was named simply Hale Estate. By then, it held a great deal. She tried again, warmer each time, which told me the closing was getting closer, and they needed something from me. The buyer's title company, it turned out, had asked for a waiver from every possible heir before they'd insure the sale. Not because the law required it, but because careful companies clear every shadow before they wire that much money. They needed the thrown-out daughter to sign one small cooperative page. The Sunday dinner my mother kept inviting me to, I noticed, fell in the same week Diane Mercer had told me our petition would be heard. I let the invitations pile up unanswered, dated, filed, and then on a gray Tuesday, Diane Mercer called. "It's done," she said. "I filed the petition this morning to set aside the old probate and admit the 2014 will, and I recorded a Ellis pendants against the property." I heard her shuffle papers. That's a public notice that the title is in dispute. In plain terms, no title company in the state will touch that sale now. It's frozen. Solid. A beat. They'll get served tomorrow. With your name on it, Adele, they're going to know exactly who's coming. I thanked her and hung up, and stood in my kitchen for a while, looking at the red circle on the calendar that no longer meant anything, and at my grandmother's photograph propped against the backsplash, her hand up against a sun 8 years set. I thought that would be the moment it all started moving fast. I was right. But I had the direction wrong. Because the next morning, my phone rang. Not my mother, not my father. Bryn. For the first time in our adult lives, my sister was calling me. The truth doesn't need volume. It needs a witness. I let it ring twice before I answered. Out the window, the morning was the flat white of late winter. Adele. Bryn's voice was wrong, not the bored, amused voice from the lawn. Tight, scared even. There's something's frozen the sale of Grandma's house. Some legal thing got filed? Mom's losing it. Did you? She stopped. Was this you? I could have hit her with all of it right there. The will, the trust, the $8,000 on the day of the funeral. I didn't. I'm a forensic accountant. I don't show the books before the meeting. I asked her one question instead, gently, the way Grandma used to ask me things. Bryn, did Mom ever show you Grandma's actual will? The real document signed? Or did she just tell you what it said? The silence on the line was the loudest thing I'd heard in years. What do you mean? Bryn said slowly. The actual will. I mean the paper, I said. Signed by Grandma. Did you ever see it with your own eyes? Mom handled the estate, she said, but the certainty was draining out of her as she said it, like she was hearing herself for the first time. She said Grandma wanted everything split, and the house to stay in the family, and... Adele, what is this? What do you have? Ask Mom, I said. Ask her to show you Grandma's 2014 will. Watch her face when you say the date. I hung up. I didn't enjoy it. I want to be clear about that because the easy version of this story is one where I savor my sister's fear, and that isn't the true version. I felt something closer to sorrow. She'd been handed a crown and never told it was stolen. My mother's response was faster and exactly what I expected. Not a call, a summons. By that evening, the family meeting machinery was grinding into motion. My mother, Carol, was gathering everyone at the house before the hearing, the way she gathered everyone for everything, to set the story straight before the world could hear a different one. I went. I want you to understand that I chose to go into the house that was now legally mine and that none of them knew it yet. And I sat at that dinner table in the chair nearest the kitchen door, out of pure habit, and then I caught myself, and I stood and I moved to a different chair. A small thing. It felt enormous. My father, Glenn, wouldn't look at me. My sister, Bryn, sat across the table looking like she hadn't slept, her eyes going from me to our mother and back, and my mother, Carol, took her seat at the head of the table. Vivian's seat, I noticed, the chair my grandmother used to sit in, and folded her hands and performed. "After everything I sacrificed to keep this family together," she said, her voice trembling with a grief she could turn on like a tap. "After everything I gave up, you'd drag us into a courtroom? Over money? Adele, this is exactly what I always said you were. Cold." I let her finish. Then I reached into my bag and I took out a single sheet. A copy, not the original. The original was somewhere Carol Fairbanks would never reach it, and I set it on the table, face down, between us. I didn't turn it over. "I'll see you at the hearing," I said, and I stood up, and for once in my life, I left a room before anyone gave me permission to. Behind me, I heard my sister's voice, very small. "Mom, what's the date on it? Mom, what's the date?" I didn't turn around. The door of my own house closed behind me, and the birch trees stood in the dark exactly where my grandmother had planted them. The probate courtroom was small. I want you to know that, because the movies get this wrong. No vast marble, a room the size of a classroom, fluorescent light, a judge who'd clearly heard every family destroy itself 100 ways before lunch. But it was full. Because a will contest brings the interested parties, and our family had a lot of them. My Aunt Lorraine, who'd stood frozen on the porch in the rain. 2 cousins, the buyer's representative, a patient man in a gray suit who'd come to find out why his clean little purchase had turned radioactive. And in the front, on the other side, my mother and father, with Bryn beside them sitting slightly apart, like a chair had been pulled an inch away from the rest. These were the people whose good opinion my mother had spent her whole life performing for. The exact audience she could not afford to lose. Theodore Brandt came too, slow on his cane, and the old secretary drove him. I wore gray. I sat still. Diane Mercer did the talking, and I had asked her the night before to let me handle one part myself. She'd looked at me for a long moment and agreed. My mother's attorney went first, because the burden was on us, and they wanted to set the frame. He was smooth. He spoke about a grieving family, a difficult daughter, a settled estate from years ago, a sudden grab for money, now that there was money in the air. He never once said the word will without the word old in front of it. Then my mother took the stand, because of course she did. And under her own lawyer's gentle questions, she told the story she'd been telling for 8 years, and she told it well, dabbing at her eyes. "My mother loved all of us," Carol said. "She wanted the estate divided. That's what we honored. If there was some earlier draft floating around, she let her voice catch. Well, my mother changed her mind a dozen times about everything. That 2014 paper was never finalized. It was a good lie, delivered to the right room. A year ago, it might have worked." Diane Mercer rose for the cross. She didn't raise her voice. She asked my mother to confirm she'd been the executor. Confirmed. To confirm the firm she'd used in the next county. Confirmed. To confirm she had never contacted Theodore Brandt, her mother's attorney of record for 40 years. to ask whether a more recent will existed. A pause. "I didn't think it was necessary," Carol said. "You didn't think to ask the lawyer who drafted her will," Diane Mercer said, "whether there was a will. I knew what my mother wanted." "We'll let the record speak to that," Diane Mercer said, and called Theodore Brandt. It took him a while to reach the stand. The room waited. He was sworn in with one shaking hand, raised, and then he sat, and he looked across the small room at my mother, and something in his old face was almost pity. "I drafted Vivian Hale's last will and testament in the autumn of 2014, he said. "I notarized it myself. I watched her sign it. She gave me the original to hold, and she gave me an instruction." He drew a breath. "She told me her daughter would try to manage the estate her own way, and that I was to deliver a sealed envelope to her granddaughter Adele when the time came. I did not know Vivian had died. No one informed me. For 8 years I held that envelope believing my client was alive." He turned his head to the judge. "The will I drafted leaves the house on Cedar Hollow Road to Adele Fairbanks. Solely. The document admitted to probate was an earlier draft my client had explicitly revoked. I would have testified to this 8 years ago. I was never asked." My mother's lawyer objected to something. The judge overruled it without much interest. I watched my mother's face the whole time, and I want to describe what happened to it, because it's the only revenge I ever actually wanted. It didn't crumble. Not yet. It hardened. It went smooth and bright and furious. The look of a woman watching a stage she'd built for 30 years begin, quietly, to come apart under her. "Anyone can wave an old paper," she said. "Not to anyone, to the room." That was when Diane Mercer looked at me, and I stood. This is the part I'd asked for. I walked to the table where the documents were laid out, and I picked up the bank records, and I crossed to the front, and I didn't shout. I have never once needed to shout. "These are the statements from the trust my grandmother set up," I said. $200,000 to be held for her grandchildren. I set down the first page. Withdrawal, withdrawal, withdrawal. I laid them out one at a time, sliding each across the table toward my mother, the way you deal cards to someone who's about to lose. Tuition, wedding, car, none of them mine. About $160,000, gone. I laid down the last page, the one I'd marked in red, and this one. My voice did not change. $8,000, the memo says miscellaneous. I looked up at my mother for the first time. I read documents for a living, so let me read you the date. This withdrawal was made the day we buried her. This is your signature, Mom. On the day of the funeral. While I was standing in the hallway, asking if there was anything she'd wanted me to have. The room had gone completely silent, and then a sound I hadn't planned for. A chair scraping back. Bryn, on her feet, white-faced, staring at the pages on the table. "What money for me?" she said. Her voice cracked down the middle. "What wedding fund? What car? I took out a loan for that car. I'm still paying for that wedding." She turned on our mother. "What did you do with Grandma's money, Mom? What did you do with mine?" This is the peak, so I'll keep it short, the way the worst and best moments always are. My mother stood up. "Bryn, sit down," she snapped. "Glenn, say something. She's twisting it. She's always twisted everything." Nobody moved to help her. I took out my phone. "You left me a voicemail," I said. "The night you all found out about the money. I kept it." I pressed play, and I held it up, and my mother's own voice filled that little fluorescent room, warm and false and 8 days old. "Sweetheart, we were only ever trying to protect you." I stopped it there. "Protect me," I said. And here, only here, I let go of the word I'd called her my whole life. Protect me from what, Carol? From my own grandmother's wishes? Or from finding out what you took? Not Mom. Carol. I watched the name land. I watched it take something from her that no document could. The one role she'd always held over me. The only power she had left in that room. She opened her mouth and nothing came out. And then it all came out at once. The wrong way, her voice rising, turning on my father. "You signed those too, Glenn. Don't you sit there." Turning on her own lawyer. Turning, finally, on Bryn, the daughter she'd spent everything protecting, who was now looking at her like a stranger. The mask didn't slip. It shattered, and she did it herself, with her own hands, in front of every person whose opinion she'd ever cared about. The judge let it run for a moment, the way you let a kettle finish screaming before you take it off the heat. Then he tapped his pen. Once, he ruled from the bench on the matter before him. The 2014 will was valid. The old probate was set aside as procured by concealment. The sale of the house was void. The trust accounting, he noted, would be referred for further proceedings, which is a calm way of saying my mother's troubles were not ending in that room. They were only beginning. I didn't celebrate. I want you to know that. I stood in the front of a small, bright room and watched a family I'd waited my whole life to belong to finish tearing itself apart, and I felt no joy in it. I felt the particular hollow quiet that comes after a noise you've been bracing against for 34 years finally stops. If you've ever had to stand up to the people who were supposed to protect you, you already know the secret nobody tells you. It doesn't feel like winning. It feels like setting down something you didn't know you'd been carrying. Maybe you've reached that moment in your own life already. Maybe you're still carrying it, and you're hearing this with both hands full. Either way, stay with me a little longer. Because the will and the trust were never really the point. There was one last thing my grandmother had asked me to do, and I hadn't done it yet. Some doors only open once you stop knocking on the ones that were never yours. A few weeks later, I drove back up Cedar Hollow Road. Alone. The rain was long gone. It was one of those raw, bright Vermont afternoons where the birches stand bare and silver against a hard blue sky. My father had changed the locks at some point during all of it. A small, useless act of control. His last one. So my old key didn't work. It didn't matter. Theodore Brandt had given me something better. After the hearing, in the parking lot, leaning on his cane, the old secretary holding his arm, he had reached into his coat and taken out a small brass key on a worn ribbon. Vivian's key, the original. She'd left it with the envelope, he said. He'd held it 8 years with everything else. She trusted me with this, he'd said, pressing it into my palm. I won't fail her twice. I stood on the porch, my porch, and I put my grandmother's brass key into the new lock my father had installed to keep me out. It turned on the first try. I want to let that sit, because it's the truest thing in this whole story. The lock my father changed never fit her key. Hers fit mine on the first try. The door swung open on the smell of old wood and cold rooms, and underneath it, faint and impossible, something like her. I walked through the house that was mine now. I didn't take much. I set my grandmother's framed photograph, the one from the mud, the one that had been the only thing on my wall for 8 years, on the kitchen table by the window, where she used to write her letters, where the birches showed through the glass. There was one more thing to do. I'd thought, for a while, about what to do with the house. I had $7 million. I didn't need it. I could have sold it out from under all of them, the cleanest revenge there is, turned my grandmother's home into a wire transfer, and never looked back. I'm not going to do that. The house knew who belonged in it. I'm going to keep it, and I'm going to keep the birches. And I've started something with Diane Mercer's help. A small fund, run out of Birchwood, that does for other people what nobody did for me for 8 years. It finds the wills that get buried. It traces the trusts that get drained. It reads the documents that families hope no one will ever read. My grandmother turned a wound into a door. I'm trying to turn mine into a key for somebody else. My parents are facing the consequences now. The real ones. The kind that don't care about performance. The trust repayment, the legal exposure, the long, cold winter of a community that watched a respectable woman come apart in a courtroom. I don't gloat about it. I don't think about it much at all, which is its own kind of freedom. But Bryn called again. Last week. Not scared this time. Just quiet. I told her she could come up to the house. And on that bright, raw afternoon, I heard a car on the gravel, and I opened my own door, and my sister stood on the porch where our father had called me a failure, looking smaller than I'd ever seen her. She didn't know what to say. Neither did I. There's no clean way back across that much water. I made tea. We took it out under the birch trees, the way I used to with Grandma. Bryn held her cup with both hands and looked at the house like she'd never really seen it. I didn't know, she said. About any of it. The money, the will. I swear to you, Adele, I didn't know. I know, I said, and I found that I did. I didn't promise her the world. I'm not the fridge with infinite room. Nobody is. And pretending otherwise is how families like ours break in the first place. I drew a line, clear and kind, about what I would and wouldn't carry from the old days into whatever this was. She nodded. She cried a little. I let her. Then I told her the only thing I had left to give. The thing Grandma had really left me, underneath the deed and the brass key and the burned-down lies. Grandma left me the door, I said. I'm choosing to leave it open for one person. I nodded at the empty chair beside me, under the trees. Sit down. She sat. We didn't fix everything that afternoon. You don't. But the light came down through the bare, silver branches my grandmother had planted so the house wouldn't forget how to grow. And for the first time, I was not earning my place in it. I was simply in it. The house always knew who belonged in it. It just took me 34 years and one envelope to believe her,